So, hi guys, this one is about the market for loanable funds. It's essentially an extension of what we've done before about exchange rate and NCO and NX, etc. So coming back to the identity done in the last video, that is S is equals to I plus NCO, that is savings is equals to domestic investment net capital outflow. This was done in the last video. If you're still a little confused, एक बार वो वापस देख लेना है, पढ़ लेना, ठीक है? Um, Now just recalling the relationship between the interest rates and SNI. Savings positively depend on real interest rate. That is because if you're parking your money as savings somewhere in a bank, and if there are higher interest rates, which means that will give you higher return when it's still there parked, and investment is negatively related because if the interest rate is higher, the cost of borrowing money is higher, and that is why investments have a negative relationship. Now, looking at the relationship between NCO and real interest rate, so there's a negative relationship between real interest rate and net capital outflows, and that is why it is a downward sloping line. So, say for instance that there's a fall in the domestic interest rate R, and US is the home country because in the books it's taken as the home country. So, if US being the home country, there's a fall in the R, it makes the assets of USA make less attractive compared to foreign assets, right? So the people of US will purchase more of foreign assets, and the people abroad will purchase lesser of US assets, and that is why NCO rises. So here, for the rest of the chapter, also it's important to understand what does the NCO rise or fall essentially mean. So if people in the home country are purchasing more assets of the foreign and the people elsewhere are purchasing lesser assets, it's called a rise in the NCO because there's an outflow of capital, right? Now, so we've established a negative relationship. Now, loanable funds market. So the loanable funds market, the axis here is very important to understand. Um, one side is the real interest rate and the other is the loanable funds. The supply of loanable funds is essentially the savings. So because whatever you're saving is what you're going to give out in the market as funds. And the downward sloping curve, which is the demand, is I plus NCO, because for these two purposes is why you're going to demand funds from the market, that is investing or capital outflow. In this market, the changes in the savings and I plus NCO is going to determine the interest rate. Right. Now, taking an example, suppose the government runs a budget deficit, right? So the G component is going to decrease. Wait. So now looking at an example, suppose the government runs a budget deficit, right? So what happens to the diagram if you try and understand? So say because of the rise in the deficit, there will be lesser savings in the economy because now they're spending more than they're earning. That is what essentially a deficit means. So if the savings reduces, savings was the supply of the loanable fund, which is the upward sloping curve. So that curve will now shift to the left and become S2. And as seen in the diagram, if the curve has shifted upwards without a change in the demand, the interest rate is going to rise and hence R1 becomes R2. Now, this was the market for the loanable funds. If that interest rate we take for the market of the net capital outflow with an increase in the R2, now we've understood before that say if the interest rate in the USA increases, the US assets will become more lucrative for people outside, and hence the purchase of assets in US is happening more than what we as US citizens are purchasing outside. So there's a net capital outflow reduces, right? And as seen in the diagram. Now, if you do have a little confusion about how R and NCO changes, because it's very important further also, just remember it as a downward sloping curve. And whenever there's a change or shift, you'll be able to understand through the graph. So just remember this graph, it's very important. Now this. So from the last video, you understood that NCO and NX are equitable identities and how NX is the demand for dollars and NCO is the supply for dollars, because if you want to export more, you need to procure dollar from the market, so that's the demand for dollars. And NCO is a supply because say if you want to purchase foreign assets, you have to sell dollars to obtain that asset, and therefore NCO is the supply of dollars in the foreign exchange market. Okay, so now we look at the market for the foreign exchange, foreign currency exchange, and basically the relationship between NCO and exchange rate. So, for instance, if there's an increase in your exchange rate value, then your goods, that is US home country's goods, become more expensive, and that is why it reduces the demand for the US goods, right? So then, looking at this graph, if there's an increase in E, it essentially has no impact on savings or investments, right? So that is why here your NCO or the supply is a vertical line, because that is not going to be impacted by exchange rate. In the other diagram, it was an upward sloping line because this axis had R, and interest rates impact both your NCO and your net exports. But your exchange rate will not impact your net capital outflows, right? And that is why it's a vertical line. So now, if say the basic crux of this diagram is that whatever in this situation, exchange rates always adjust to balance the supply of dollars in the market. That's all they're trying to establish here. Now, they're explaining that why net exports is essentially the net demand for dollars and net capital outflows is essentially the supply of dollars. They've broken it down. So here, say for instance that somebody in our home country or US, they buy um, goods from outside. They import goods. So what happens? There are two things that happen. Since you're buying goods, you're going to sell your dollars, or basically give dollars to buy that good, to acquire that good from some other country, right? So the supply of dollars is going to increase, and because you are buying more or importing more, your net exports is going to fall. Now, since here there are both impacts coming into play, however, we will consider the second one because it's more convenient to use this in this model, right? So here, whenever there is a purchase or import, we say that there is a demand for dollars because you need to buy that good, and that is why you need more dollars, and that is why net exports is the net demand for dollars. Okay. Now, in a similar manner, say a foreigner buys an US asset, right? So two things will happen. That since the foreigner will need more US dollars to purchase this asset, the demand for dollars will increase. But at the same time, as we've understood before, that whenever the foreign purchase of home asset is more than what we are buying from outside, there's a fall in the net capital outflows. In the diagram, we've seen that. So here, there are two effects that come into play. However, even though both views are equivalent, we will use the second one, which basically shows that NCO is the net supply of dollars, right? So coming to another example, we've seen in the similar one earlier that when there's a budget deficit by the government, your R or interest rate rises and your NCO falls. Right now, we're going to extend this to the exchange rate market. Now that we've understood the relationship between supply, which is the straight line demand, and the exchange, right? So as seen before, your real interest rate has risen and your NCO has fallen. Since your NCO, you can refer this entire thing in the previous slides. So whenever there's a budget deficit and your NCO reduces and the supply of the dollar falls, the curve shifts towards the left. Here, since the axis is exchange rate, the line is vertical and hence it's shifting towards the left. And that is why the real exchange rate, as seen through the diagram, is going to appreciate. And whenever the currency appreciates, it's more expensive for anybody outside the country to buy your goods, and that is why the net exports are going to fall. And that is why this is the entire situation. Now, so to summarize from the starting, there's a government deficit, the national savings are going to fall. In the previous diagram, we see that the saving curves shift towards the left, and that leads to a rise in the interest rates. Because of the rise in the interest rate, when we take it down to the NCO, your NCO is going to fall, right? And because your domestic investment and capital outflow both are going to fall. So when the real exchange rate appreciates, as seen in the last one, your net exports fall. And this is the entire cycle, that whenever there's an increase in the interest rate, there's an increase in the there's an appreciation of your currency and your net exports fall, right? Right. So this is how they've tried to establish the relationship between real interest rate and exchange rate. That whenever there's a rise in the real interest rate, the NCO reduces, and as seen in the next diagram, the vertical one, you see that there's a appreciation of your currency. Right. So now, say there was a situation when your government deficit was rising. So here we see a situation, say the government provides new tax incentive to encourage the investments, right? So now we're trying to understand how this is going to impact all these factors in our model. So what happens here is that since there's a incentive to invest more, the demand for your loanable funds is going to rise because now everybody wants more money to be able to invest in the market. right? So here your downward sloping curve, which is a demand curve, is going to rise upwards, right? D1 goes to D2, right? So here again, the interest rate is going to rise, that is R1 to R2. Taking it to the net capital outflow, we've learned that whenever there's a rise in the domestic interest rate, your net capital outflow is going to fall, right? So very clearly seen in the diagram. Now taking it and seeing the impact on the exchange rate, whenever there's a fall in the NCO, the curve shifts leftward. And because of this appreciation, your exchange rate, that is your exchange rate rises and E1 to E2, and this will reduce your exports. It's a very similar situation that has happened, but the difference that E has risen, NCO falls, E rises, NX falls. But the major difference between the budget deficit and the investment is that investment will also increase productivity and growth and the living standards in the long run. So even though in the short run the impact is the same, that the currency has appreciated and the exports have fallen, an investment incentive will lead to an increase in the productivity and living standards in the long run, right? Now looking at trade policies, so a lot of times the government puts a lot of tariffs or quotas or restrictions on any kind of imports or exports from the country. Now we're trying to analyze, say in our model where we're trying to understand the effect of an import quota on cars from Japan to, in order to save the jobs in the US automobile industry. So what happens is that this is the market for loanable funds and this is the net capital outflow diagram. And an import quota is not going to affect your NCO, because NCO is essentially savings and investment, right? Because as you learned, this is just the same equation that we've understood, that savings is equals to NCO plus I. We've just taken I that side. So if savings and investments are not impacted, NCO is not going to change in case of a quota, right? So here we see that since this is the market for foreign currency exchange with exchange rate here and dollars here, and NCO is the supply of dollars. And if NCO is not going to change, the supply curve will stay intact, right? And however, if your imports are restricted, your net exports are going to rise, right? And that is why your demand for dollars, which is the NX, is going to move rightwards. So as it moves rightwards, to restore equilibrium, since the supply is not moving, the exchange rate moves up as seen in the diagram from E1 to E2. And when your exchange rate moves up, you will realize that because the exchange rate has adjusted to restore the equilibrium, the NX, that is this part of the diagram, is essentially not going to change. The level of your net exports is still the same. So what it's trying to establish is that if the exchange rate is adjusting in order to restore equilibrium, then the policy of restricts or tariffs, etc., is not going to reduce or trade deficit. If it were a situation that the exchange rate was not adjusting, only then is a situation where you're going to reduce your imports. But however, here the change in the exchange rate is going to make everything back to the same equilibrium. This is a case study which you can have a look at later, right? So here now we're looking at a situation where there is a political instability and how it impacts the flow of funds between countries, right? So here we're seeing that there is political instability in Mexico, and it would make other people uh, doubtful of investing in that country, right? So we analyze in this model from the perspective of Mexico. So Mexico here becomes the home country. Usually US is taken as the home country, but here Mexico is the home country where there is political instability and people are not willing to invest in that country or pull out their already existing investments, right? So capital flight from Mexico. So here what happens is that foreign investors sell all their assets and pull out the capital from the country. So in Mexico, when people are selling off their assets, your NCO rises because now you are buying more as a Mexican citizen, you are buying more than people are buying from your own country, because people now don't want to hold Mexican assets. So your NCO increases at each value of R. So here the NCO curve shifts towards the right in the net capital outflow diagram. And when it shifts towards the right, your demand curve will also shift upwards, because what is essentially the demand curve? It's NCO plus I, the loanable funds demand. So both these curve will shift upwards. And because of this, to restore equilibrium, your interest rate, as seen through both the diagrams, is going to increase. That is why R1 moves to R2. Now, extending this to the market for foreign exchange currency, when we look at this, the increase in the NCO will shift the supply curve towards the right, and the demand curve hasn't changed, and that is why the exchange rate is going to depreciate. Right. So here, when the curve moves towards the right, your exchange rate has fallen from E1 to E2, and that is why the value of peso has fallen. Right. So what we're trying to conclude here is that whenever there is a flight capital pulled out from a country because of any kind of political instability, where people are not showing confidence in investing in your economy, your currency is going to depreciate because people wouldn't want more of your assets, right? And that is it about this chapter. You can go through the PPTs once, because there's a lot of case studies that he's given and pointers in very short, but that's about it. Thank you.